We've already done introductions. We're going to get right down to it. There's a lot that we're going to cover, so we're going to try to keep a pretty fast battle rhythm here. U.S. national security has been obviously a major theme at this summit, and for good reason. Concern about bad actors engaging in criminal activity using blockchain technology, whether it's hacking smart contracts, stealing funds from individual users, or money laundering, has never been more pronounced. In particular, the activities of North Korean hackers, including the Lazarus Group, have caused alarm across federal agencies, in the halls of Congress, and at the White House. While it is recognized pretty much on all sides that this criminal conduct is a very small percentage of the overall crypto transactions, recent history has shown how seriously the U.S. government is taking these issues. We have smart contract protocols being banned under U.S. sanctions regimes, and major crypto intermediaries are being prosecuted. Just yesterday from this stage, as Dave referred, the Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Treasury made it clear that the state of affairs is unacceptable. And I took him to be saying, in effect, that the future of crypto, at least in the United States, depends on addressing these problems effectively, and I think he's probably right about that. We could not convene a better panel of speakers to help us understand these problems we face, what is being done today, and what we really need to be doing going forward. They are on the front lines, and I hope we can in the next 45 minutes or so. It says 35, but ignore that. We better understand the reality of the situation, and at least how it's perceived from their vantage point. So starting with you, Jessica, you're at the Department of Justice, used to be on the National Crypto Enforcement Task Force.
Close enough.
Close enough. You are in the criminal division. You sit in the front office, but you're tethered to the computer crime and intellectual property section. You work with the money laundering and asset recovery section. What is your role in prosecuting, investigating this type of activity?
Yeah, sure. So I wear a couple of hats for DOJ. Like Bill said, I work for our front office, which means that I'm currently a senior counsel for our Assistant Attorney General in the criminal division. I mostly focus on cyber and crypto policy. I am also a trial attorney in our computer crime section, and I spend most of my time on litigation to do with North Korean cyber hacks, working with folks like Chris Wong and Kevin and now Taylor. Hi. And so that's where most of my focus is.
And Chris, what precisely are you doing with the FBI? What's your unit called, and what's its focus?
Sure, I'm a supervisory special agent with the FBI, currently assigned to the FBI's virtual assets unit. So we're kind of the one-stop shop for the FBI when it comes to virtual assets. We provide training, enhancing capability, building capacity, but also direct case support. And in the case of North Korea, kind of got my start there about 7 years ago in Chicago, and still work it, and that means tracing assets, freezing and seizing where possible, mitigating loss as much as possible.
And Kevin, so your role in FinCEN, maybe a little bit about what FinCEN does generally, but what your role in your unit does specifically.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that, and thank you very much to the association for having me. In my role, I sort of sit from a supervisory perspective, so my office is responsible for looking at the compliance with the Bank Secrecy Act for all virtual asset service providers in the United States, or operating wholly or in substantial part in the United States. So that's one of our major functions, but if you look at FinCEN more broadly, obviously, we're the financial intelligence unit of the United States, so we interact and have a lot of relationships with other governments and how they supervise crypto elsewhere. We also are the hub where reporting comes in, so we make our financial intelligence available to law enforcement to help them build cases and look at typologies more broadly. And then we also have a role as a public-private sector dialogue, where through programs like FinCEN Exchange, we can share information with the private sector so that they can be, more robustly identify this typologies and activity and disrupt it.
So Taylor is not a Fed. I don't think she's ever been a Fed.
I am not a Fed.
I don't want to know what it would take to have her fill out one of those application forms to get a background check. But the simple point is, I understand that Taylor is one of the most talented blockchain tracers out there, at least for Ethereum. And so you invented a number of wallets, or founder of, you're a crypto founder. You now work with MetaMask. Tell everyone essentially what you spend 20 hours a day doing.
Yeah, so I definitely came about this in a different way. I've been in crypto for like a decade now, which is insane. I built my Ether wallet, which was was the first Ethereum wallet. Now I'm with MetaMask. And so my experience with threat actors, and especially the ones that are crypto threat actors, comes from actually my users over the years. And when you build a wallet for users, those users end up getting wrecked. And so over the years, I sort of learned how to identify, like, what are the different threats that are targeting my users? How do I identify them? And then I always was just very curious. Like, you can see the stolen funds leave the user's wallet. You can see that. Therefore, you should be able to do something about that. And over the years, I have continued to ask that question. And at this point, I spend most of my time tracing and tracking, especially North Korean hackers and the different things that they're doing and the different ways they target people. And all of it is ideally so that we have less ordinary people who are just going about their lives losing money. That's my goal.
So let's turn to Lazarus. I'm starting with Jessica and Chris. How is North Korea generating revenue with cryptocurrencies? What types of crimes are they committing? And then I guess for Chris, how are they getting the funds back to North Korea?
Yeah, sure. So for those who aren't familiar, North Korea generally generates revenue in two different ways. Through crypto crime, so that's going to be hacking into networks, stealing money from virtual currency exchanges, DeFi platforms, what have you. Also, to a lesser extent, they're engaging in ransomware deployments. And then the second way that they're generating crypto revenue through crypto crime is through the deployment of IT workers abroad. So they're sending IT workers to lots of different countries, mostly Russia, Laos, China, and they are blockchain developers working for typically unwitting companies. They ask to be paid in cryptocurrency, and then they send basically all of their salaries back to North Korea to support ballistic missile programs and other WMD programs for North Korea.
And how are they sending it back? There's not exactly a wire transfer that goes to North Korea.
Western Union? No, just kidding. So I'm sure people wouldn't be surprised that North Korea can't buy ballistic missiles with cryptocurrency. So they need to get to fiat currency, and generally speaking, that fiat currency, those roads go through China for the most part. So after a lot of laundering processes on-chain, there's this process by which funds get moved off-chain or off-ramped, and that generally goes through over-the-counter traders. For those people who are not familiar with over-the-counter traders, at least for the North Koreans, they act as intermediaries between exchanges. They have liquidity in both fiat currency and cryptocurrency. And essentially what they're doing is doing currency arbitrage with both fiat currency and cryptocurrency, kind of earning revenue on that exchange, where the North Koreans might give them a discount on the price of the crypto that they have. Generally speaking, most of these, they can be witting, they can be unwitting. Unwitting in the sense that they might be burying their head in the sand. Not asking any of the KYC questions or due diligence on where these funds are coming from.
Yeah. And so, Taylor, when you're looking on chain, we talked about this process of laundering on chain. Just quickly, what does that normally entail? Essentially, it's just hopping from protocol to protocol in maybe large chunks or small chunks. What does it actually look like?
Yeah, so their laundering tactics have evolved over the years, and they're evolved because the different players around the crypto ecosystem have been stopping them from using their products, from cashing out at their services. And so the laundering evolves in reaction to people stopping them. And if you look at their very earliest laundering, it was basically just a straight shot. They just took the crypto from, they would hack an exchange, hack a person, and it would just be a straight shot out, right? And then as the industry on the whole has improved at blocking them, at freezing them, at detecting this, their laundering has gotten a bit more complex. And today I would say that they, I think that most people in this room could not imagine just the scale and the scope of the operation. They will start with a chunk of funds that have already been laundered. So they've already gone through mixers, they've already done a whole cycle around. They will start that, and they will essentially split it up and then just shoot it out in a million different directions. If they're getting frozen right there, they will then take each one of those pieces and shoot it out again. And they will go across all the bridges. They will use centralized services. They'll use decentralized services. They will basically do anything to outrun outrun the technology, outrun the people, even just like slip one through, right? And
could I ask Kevin something on this point? What over this time period, from a financial intelligence perspective, has been the biggest lesson from watching this?
Well, I think this is actually one of the big success stories we get sort of out of the private sector, right? Because one of the things we're seeing is that more virtual asset service providers are actually providing reports on this kind of typology. So the types of layering that Taylor is describing that are going through these different intermediaries that are doing, maybe cross-chain swaps, we're actually starting to see more reporting that reflects that because the investigators are getting more sophisticated at that. So I think that, from a collection standpoint, we're actually able to get more from the US government perspective to enable people like Chris to go after the bad actors.
And let's stay with that for a second. FinCEN just proposed a rule triggering Patriot Act surveillance of transactions involving mixers, generally. What does FinCEN propose, and what feedback are you expecting, hoping from the public?
Yeah, and I do have to be careful here because it is a pending rulemaking, so there's not a lot of detail I can go into about this. But, as Taylor sort of exemplified, mixing services are used to launder money. I don't think that's a big surprise. We've identified them as a primary money laundering concern as part of this action under Section 311 of the USA Patriot Act. We proposed a rule, it's a notice of proposed rulemaking, looking at types of record keeping that would enable law enforcement to better identify and receive information on these kinds of transactions for laundering. So we have a purposely long comment period. We really welcome comments. I think so far there's been 1,200 comments on the rulemaking so far, the last I checked. Don't hold me to that. But it's open through January. So we really do actually want people's thoughts on is this the right scope? Are we looking at the right things? What collection will help us tackle this problem?
And the proposed rule is really about putting financial institutions and other intermediaries essentially on notice that transactions involving mixers require closer scrutiny. It's not proposing to ban
That's
the use of
right.
mixers.
I think that's a very important thing. It is a record-keeping requirement. And I think, and again, this is Kevin's opinion and not that of the US government, I think if you were to go to most centralized services and ask them if they're already looking for this kind of typology, I would think most of them would say yes.
Sticking with mixers and tornado cash, I want to ask you, Jessica, what has the impact from your perspective of the sanctioning of tornado cash? From what you see out there in the real world, its impact, what can you tell us?
Yeah, so now I will have to do the lawyer thing and say my opinions are my own. I am not here speaking on behalf of the Attorney General of the United States. And just to clarify, do you mean the impact on North Korea, or do you mean writ large? Because I don't want to walk into that buzzsaw. I don't have to.
Both. Why not? Why not both?
So I would say
specifically North Korea, but I think maybe generally it would flow from that.
So I think it brought a lot of attention to mixing overall, and the fact that it's a significant money laundering concern. And whenever you have a particular platform that is being used to launder $1 billion, including funds tied to North Korean cyber attacks, like that is a huge problem and needs to be rectified. And so I think, in addition to bringing light to all these things, the sanctions did a good thing in that they dropped, almost 90% of the liquidity in tornado cash, and most folks don't use it. But talking about North Korea,
and when you're dropping liquidity, you actually make transactions a little more transparent for the mixer. When you have less transactions coming in and out all the time, you can perhaps trace through the mixer more easily.
So we talked about it before. North Korea adapts, and they adapt quickly. One of the things that we see, even though Tornado Cash had a drastic drop in liquidity, is that at times North Korea still uses Tornado Cash, but also at times they don't need to use Tornado Cash, and maybe they'll just go to another protocol and chain hop with that process. But they also adapt the way that they use Tornado Cash, and so potentially leave assets in Tornado Cash longer and make it more difficult for us to identify what withdrawals might be theirs.
And that goes to Taylor's point that what they're looking to do is slip through. So all they're trying to do is break the on-chain connection to the fact that they're moving stolen funds for even 10 minutes because, as you guys have seen, every day, 24/7, they move money faster than anybody else in the game.
And the biggest problem is it's hard to catch up.
Well,
if you don't know where they're going, it's hard to catch up.
So the biggest thing about the North Korean threat actors versus basically any other threat actor is that they actually don't care if you determine that the flows were North Korean as long as they're already gone. Where most other threat actors, right, if you imagine a kid in the US who hacks something, right, their goal is to always ensure that their identity is not determined by anyone, and so they're much more careful. North Korea, they truly do not care if you figure out that transaction, that deposit, that account, or whatever it was. They don't care if you figure it out, so long as you do it after the money is gone. And that makes them a really different threat to track and try to stop.
So we're going to see, I know none of you represent OFAC, and if you did, you couldn't comment on it. We're going to see, I think, more sanctioning of mixers. You saw one yesterday, Sinbad, which I know neither of you want me to ask you about, but it's a BTC mixer, which I think was pretty notorious as a source for money laundering. That was sanctioned as of yesterday, and so I think we're going to continue to see this as a law enforcement or a mitigation tactic. Taylor.
Yes.
Mixers are not the
Yes.
only thing being sanctioned. Exchanges overseas are being sanctioned. From your perspective, are you seeing an impact? What's the effect of the sanctions on these exchanges like Garantex, the famous Bits Lotto, which no one in crypto had heard about prior to an announcement of
That was
of
a
the sanctioning?
9714 act by FinCEN.
Okay, very good. But what's the impact?
It wasn't technically sanctioned. No, but regardless, I think that one thing that perhaps both the crypto ecosystem and the general population believe is if you sanction something, it's done, it's killed, it doesn't exist anymore, and that's actually not the case. We should definitely not be thinking of sanctions as the end of the road, where if everything else fails, then we sanction it, and then that fixes it. That's actually not the case. With Tornado Cash, it's still being used. Yes, the liquidity went down. Yes, less people use it, but it is still being used. But also, when you look at especially the services that are mostly in Russia and to a certain extent China, Garantex specifically is in Russia. We actually
That's an exchange.
Yeah, it's a centralized exchange. It's based in Russia. The sanctions had very little impact on them. The founder and the CEO of it is still running around, loudly proclaiming that everyone's money is safe and disregard the United States. The volumes are up since the sanctions, and so when we think about the different tools that we have as both a crypto industry, as builders, as developers, as whatever we are, but also the tools that law enforcement and government has, we have to understand that we need to use different combinations of the things that we have available. We need to get creative, and we need to figure out what actually is going to stop it. Because the reality is that an OFAC designation to a centralized exchange in Russia isn't going to be enough if you actually want to stop the flows.
I think this is a good pivot point to an announcement last week. I think it was last week. It feels like last month. Binance resolution, DOJ pleading a Treasury settlement. This is for Kevin and Jessica. What wasn't heavily covered was that FinCEN would be monitoring Binance compliance going forward. Can you provide more detail about what that means? And for Jessica, what sort of cooperation with law enforcement will be expected of Binance by virtue of these outcomes going forward? We can start.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you gave me an opportunity to sort of talk about that element, because I think you're right. I think one of the unique elements of the Binance action that gets lost in the dollar figures behind it, which are notably significant, is this monitorship. And really, this is the first time that FinCEN has taken a monitorship that's this extensive, and it really has a couple important components to it. The first is that it has an AML program component, and that means that the monitor is going to oversee changes to Binance's AML program to ensure that it meets the standards that it needs to have sufficient anti-money laundering controls in place. The second is a SAR look back. And if you notice in both DOJ's resolution and FinCEN's in particular, it talks about the extensive transactions that went through Binance and were not reported to the government when they had an obligation to do so. And so the scope of this look back will cover a substantial amount of Binance's time period where they will have to make whole the transactions that they did not file with the US government.
And so the way I think about this is you have a transparent ledger. A problem is inside a closed order book, inside an institution, you don't have that transparency. It sounds like, and you don't need to comment if it's inappropriate to, but it sounds like we now get to see, or law enforcement and regulators now get to peer inside of Binance and connect transparent on-chain flows with stuff that's been going on inside Binance for perhaps years. Years in the past, and you now are able to link up the ledger in that regard.
Yeah, I think there's parameters that will be around it, but the idea is that in a functioning financial institution, they should have processes to detect and report this activity anyways. And so, you know, because Binance was not doing that, they're going to have to do that now in a reactive way, looking back at those past transactions, making those filings to FinCEN so that we can make law enforcement, give that information to law enforcement to go after the bad guys that they need to. And as we saw in FinCEN's investigation, that were a number of bad actors that pretty much check off all of the boxes of illicit activity.
And then on their work with law enforcement, I would say that contrary to probably what the general public might think, over the last couple of years, Binance has been very responsive to law enforcement. Chris can talk more about this, but they do have one of the best analysts on their team that knows everything about North Korean cyber hacks and North Korean money laundering, and works, you know, pretty closely with the FBI and IRS on some of these cases.
Do you want to expand on that?
Sure. When we are tracing assets and we're trying to stop the flow of stolen funds, we're trying to freeze assets of virtual currency exchanges, instant exchanges, whatever it may be, oftentimes we kind of run into this conundrum of, are they cooperative? Will they produce records to us? Will they respond to a freeze request from us? And then the other question is, are they responsive? Responsiveness, especially when dealing with North Korea, is key. Like, we need rapid response because those funds are flowing through at such a fast clip that if we don't get somebody on the other end of the line being responsive, then we're not going to actually have a shot at freezing those assets. But the person that Jessica's referring to, they can take it a step further if you have really good investigators at these exchanges who know the threat, because they can proactively identify accounts that are maybe staged for laundering and kind of keep a watch on those until they come through and start laundering assets, and then you catch them on the front end. Really what we're trying to get to is a place where it's not me staying up until the middle of the night and then reaching out to somebody, you know, who knows where, asking them to freeze assets, but doing a proactive capture the first 10%, not the last 10%, and push them off platform to someplace else.
I think the lesson that I'm taking away from this is that if you do what crypto is asking policymakers to do and try to get exchanges around the world regulated, then law enforcement is better capable of actually stopping flows. That's my editorializing. Kevin, did you have something?
No, I just wanted to add, there was a third element to the monitorship that's really just ensuring that Binance does completely exit from the United States. So there's a 5-year monitor that's in place to ensure that when they say that they're out of the United States this time, that they are actually following through with that, and they have no more touch points to the U.S. financial system.
I'd like to turn to blockchain analytics. At the hearing I testified at, it was the centerpiece of the discussion. It's a developing field. It takes advantage of the transparency of the blockchain, the permanency of the transaction ledger. How effective, Chris, are analytics in tracking and stopping criminals in your view? What needs to improve? And then I also want to get Taylor's thoughts on it.
Sure. So if you're talking about following crypto and maybe catching somebody, we're pretty good at that. I mean, you look at the Bitfinex case, the transparency and permanency of the ledger is what is like a laundering choice that you make today, 5 years from now might be a mistake.
Have you met the defendants in the Bitfinex case?
Yes.
Is she cool?
I'm not going to answer that question.
She seems like a trip. All right, sorry, I interrupted.
She's very nice.
She's very nice, okay. You heard it here.
She's a very nice person, yes. But that's different than North Koreans. We're generally speaking not going to get our hands on North Koreans and put handcuffs on these folks to be able to mitigate the threat in that way. And so when it comes to this kind of catch the first 10% that I'm talking about, a lot of exchanges are already using transaction monitoring tools. But from most of the things that I've seen, oftentimes these transaction monitoring tools are not implemented effectively. What I mean is, for most exchanges, there's this spectrum of compliance to customer experience. And everybody's pegged over customer experience because they want to be able to send assets through, swap them. They don't want customers complaining about what's going on. But oftentimes, the tools that are being used to screen transactions that are coming in aren't operating at a fast enough clip to be able to handle that sort of transaction flow. And so unless exchanges induce some friction into these transactions so that they can get true indirect exposure monitoring, or in some instances when we're talking to bridge protocols who aren't implementing any sort of transaction monitoring, we're never going to get to a place where we can effectively kind of limit the scope of the movement of illicit assets on various blockchains.
Taylor, what are your thoughts on this, especially the improvement point?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple different things. One is that most of the, let's say, like decentralized builders, right, the ones that are sort of the most crypto native, we found that they have no idea how like many stolen funds are going through their protocol. I find this like shocking, not because I think that these, you know, these builders, these decentralized minded people, not because I think that they should like do so for any government, right? I think it's shocking that they don't know their user base. When we get in touch and tell them, for example, that like over 90% of their volume is from like literally stolen funds, and they're shocked by that. I'm not surprised at this point when they're shocked, right? And I think that's a problem and something that as an industry, we need to understand that, like, number one, in order to create and provide valuable services to humanity, you need to know your customer in like the sense that you need to know if your product is valuable to the people that you want to serve. And FYI, you don't want to serve hackers. Like, you just don't. It's not good. The second thing is that there is so much innovation in the space. There are new bridges, new DEXs, new centralized services. They just pop up all the time. And it's you know, even though we do have like know your transaction, even though we can like theoretically follow the money from chain to chain, the reality is like, can all the tools track and determine the flows across all the chains when, you know, a new protocol is spinning up every day? And the answer is no, not yet. I think we can get much better at that, and we need more competition in that area, right? We need more people building these tools that allow to see and connect the flows across chains.
So for Kevin, how does, from FinCEN's perspective, how do you assess, how do you assess, how do you use these new technologies like blockchain analytics? My hope is that to the extent compliance, some compliance regime is applied to sort of peer-to-peer crypto, at the very least, it doesn't look like traditional compliance regimes and does rely on these new technologies to preserve privacy to some degree in a much better way than in traditional circumstances. Like, how do you guys view these new technologies and the role they play?
No, look, it's obviously very important for all the reasons the panel talked about already. I mean, it is a supplementary piece of information that we use in addition to the other types of intelligence that we have from financial institutions, from our law enforcement partners, to give us a more complete picture of things. But we also use it very much like compliance people would do in a situation where people actually do know their customer, unlike some of the situations Taylor was describing. Because we do want to understand where there are people, the difference between the entities that are causing some friction, that are doing their due diligence, versus those that are frictionless, that are just allowing any transactions to go through their platform. I need to know where to focus too. You know, again, I think the Binance case is an excellent example for this. Why did Binance grow so large so quickly? It's because they had a policy that said, we don't do KYC under 2 Bitcoin for transactions. And you see people who mirrored that policy have equal compliance challenges, and you can see that through the blockchain. So I think, you know, there's a warning out there that, you know, if you're not going to be able to comply with that, use these tools to your advantage and meet your obligations, I mean, there are consequences to that.
So Jessica, this is a global technology, global networks, makes it challenging for that reason, also makes it very useful for that reason. for licit and illicit purposes, clearly. So law enforcement is jurisdictional. How can countries and different law enforcement agencies across borders more effectively coordinate?
There is always room for improvement, and yes, because of the cross-border nature of how money laundering happens, we do have to communicate very, very quickly and very effectively with our foreign partners. I will say, 3-4 years ago, it was really hard. You don't know who you need to contact at first, but over the last year, things have gotten more positive. We are targeting particular jurisdictions, doing training, getting to know the regulators in particular places. So I guess it's just, to answer your question, faster, better communication, getting everyone on the same page, and making sure that the private sector in each of these jurisdictions is also on board with moving information as quickly as possible.
So sitting at a company that does get law enforcement requests, I find the MLAT process in crypto, it's basically a treaty process where law enforcement in a foreign country can ask a domestic U.S. company for records. It is completely time-consuming and administratively burdensome. A lot of the information is stale by the time you get it. It's very
It takes
frustrating.
3 months to 3 years, basically.
And there's one office in DOJ who has to process everything, more or less, and so it's antiquated. I think what I also would plug is there's an effort right now to build an ISAC, which is an information sharing and action something or other. What's the C? No one knows. It's unknowable what the C means. But they're financial services ISACs. This is not a new concept, but it's new for crypto, and the idea is to share information. Companies from around the world can join these things and share information about vulnerabilities, about illicit flows, to put the actual service providers in the industry on a better footing, to actually not have their services being abused, not having their customers being abused. And so I think it's a very positive sign that the ecosystem itself is moving in this direction. Chris, and I told people on Twitter or whatever it's called these days that I would bring this up, but there was a recent discussion on social media about how it seems hackers are becoming more professional in how they organize and operate. Are you seeing this? And is this more professional hacker adversary a bigger problem than a less professional one?
So considering a lot of the laundering I look at are probably the most professional hackers out there, like literally North Korea, Reconnaissance General Bureau, they're equivalent to the CIA and NSA. It's their full-time job to go and hack into exchanges and steal money. I mean, that's about as professional as it gets, and the laundering looks that way. In terms of our hacker groups becoming more professional themselves, are they mirroring the laundering patterns of others? It's really difficult to get inside their head and determine that, but what I do see is I see an evolution of North Korean laundering, and when I look at laundering that is not necessarily North Korean, I see some of the same patterns being used. And now whether or not that's because they watch North Korea, they see what they do on the blockchain, they say, looks like a good idea, I'm gonna give that a shot too. I mean, I can tell the difference when somebody is like just kind of throwing tokens around various blockchains with no idea what they wanna do, not professional, or maybe they leave stable coins that are freezable for 48 hours, that's a mistake, not somebody that's professional. But if you start seeing people adapt and do things that are professional in the laundering sense, like I can't tell whether or not they're professional hackers, but I do know that they have a plan going into it, and I see more people having a plan.
And Taylor, are there like signatures that you recognize of particular groups, whether it's North Korea or anyone else?
Yes.
I remember you telling me once that it depends on the time of day that the
Yeah,
laundering starts.
there are so many different ways. Like when people say, like, how do you know that that's North Korea? It's like this combination of all these different things where there's no other actor that could possibly be doing this. There's things like time of day. A better example, I think, that is maybe more tangible is like when we look at like an individual one-off hacker, right? Someone hacks a DeFi protocol. Again, like a lot of times these are kids in the West who are, doing these one-off things, right? When we see those, you'll see the movement on chain will be sporadic. They'll move a bunch, and then nothing will happen for 3 days, and then they'll move a bunch. And there's not really like any correlation between like anything at all, right? It's just these random chunks of activity. When you look at like an operation, an organized operation that's laundering money or executing these thefts, you can very clearly see these bands of time where all the activity is coming in. And so you'll see like, okay, they wake up around this time, they quote unquote get to the office around this time, and like then they'll mostly do their initial thefts during this band of time, and the laundering will be in the afternoon.
They'll break for lunch, break for a cigarette, and then go back. And
I'm not kidding when I say
I don't know
that.
if North Korea provides breaks.
Yes, North Korea does provide breaks.
Like 10 hours straight.
Yeah.
We all, when we're monitoring North Korea, we're like, oh, they're on break, and that's when we get to take a break as well.
Got it. And they hit on holidays. Like they
Yeah.
use windows where they think there's going to be less scrutiny, like Veterans Day, Thanksgiving.
Yes. I will say that the federal agents who track Lazarus, it is what, yeah, they were all in the office on Veterans Day at like 6 a.m. to deal with the Poloniacs hack. And, you know, everyone was like, how do you know that that's North Korea? And I was like, well, I haven't even looked at it, but I know the feds are in the office on a frickin' holiday.
So professional, there was this ridiculous concept that professional hackers are actually better because yada yada, and I spit out my coffee, so enraged at the idea that it was actually a good idea. But that's crypto Twitter for you. I have one. It's blinking red, but I don't care. We have one more question, which is actually I think the most important question. It's what can, I want to hear from each of you, what can the crypto space do to combat these bad actors misusing these protocols, whether it's hacks, whether it's money laundering, like if there's one or two things that you could identify as like a really important change that the ecosystem itself, they're capable of doing it, and you'd encourage them to do it, what would you say?
Transaction monitoring.
Yeah, I would say there's like a life cycle. There's the data that supports what these blockchain firms that have the transaction monitoring. There is the VASPs that are implementing the transaction monitoring and making sure it's effective. And if any one of those pieces within that circle is broken, the whole system is broken. And right now, it's generally not effective, especially not against North Korea. And so what we as a government can do is, as we're tracking stolen funds, we're sharing those assets, or sharing that data back over to the blockchain firms. The VASPs are actually implementing the tool effectively. The tools get better. And then once all that process is in place, once we have stolen funds and they're marked, or they're child sexual exploitation funds, or they're sanctioned funds, whatever it is, we're limiting the ability for those assets to move across platforms, whether they're bridges, whether they're DEXs, whether they're instant exchanges or centralized exchanges, whatever it is. All of a sudden, you've turned this into money or assets that cannot be laundered. And so really, once we get that whole circle working, then I think we'll be in a much, much better place.
Yeah, it's public-private partnership, sort of building on that transaction monitoring. To what Taylor said before, I mean, look, even if you're a programmer or developer, you don't want to be known as the tool used by North Koreans or like CSAM operators. We're aligned on that from a public-private perspective. We can help each other disrupt that activity and, make a safer financial system. It's that partnership between government and private sector.
Yeah, I mean, they're all right, listen to them, but I'll come at this just slightly differently because I am so crypto native, I guess. And I think that, what I tell this ecosystem just all the time is we build like amazing things. Like we literally create these crazy protocols out of thin air. We create value out of thin air, just like poof, like there's $1 billion. I think that if this industry prioritized and had more conversations about the illicit flows and understood more about the threat actors and understood the impact that it was having on its actual legitimate users, I think that there is so much that could be done that's unimaginable today, right? Like when we first started Bitcoin, the idea that like Uniswap would exist in 5 years was not a thing, right? In the same way, if this industry decides, which it should, that like people who harm society are bad, they're bad for our products, they're bad for our teams, they're bad for everything, then we can come up with a huge amount of creative ways to stop it. And it doesn't have to be, the TradFi way of thinking about it. It doesn't mean like put all the KYC on chain. It means like working with the working with the really smart researchers and understanding the incentives and understanding the game theory, and then experimenting with that in the products and in the protocols and at the base layers, right? And that cycle, that iterative cycle, right, and everyone working together, that's where the magic will happen. And we have to do that. We can't just be, we can't be where we're at right now, where people don't even know that their product is being used exclusively
if we don't
for
figure it
illicit.
out, somebody, those guys,
Yes.
are going to figure it out for us. And I'd like to have a more organic, more emergent method of recognizing there are good people and bad people.
To be clear, we want that too.
Yeah.
I have no
Yes.
doubt.
I would like to work on something else now.
I can only imagine. If you can all join me in thanking this wonderful panel. We thank you for your service and for coming here and talking to us all today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.